in part 2 of our discussion of Reconstruction, I want to focus on what happens with Andrew Johnson and what happens with both the Southerners who have to deal with Johnson and the Congress who violently disagrees with Johnson. Now, as we said in our first tape, Johnson was a provincial, bigoted former senator from Tennessee. He was a pro-Union Democrat. He was put on Abraham Lincoln's 1864 re-election ticket as a gesture of national unity. Now, Johnson is kind of unique. Number one, he hates a lot of Southerners. He hates Southern aristocrats in particular. He sees himself as being kind of a man of the people, and those people don't include Southern planters, Southern merchants, and Southern bankers. In other words, the moneyed interest in the South and Andrew Johnson are like oil and water. They don't mix. Alright? So, when Johnson introduces his Reconstruction plan, the basic ideas are similar to Abraham Lincoln's, except that anybody with taxable income, taxable property worth more than $20,000 was excluded from citizenship. Okay? Johnson believed that state conventions ought to be created, and that those conventions ought to be called by native unionists from each of the states that had been under rebellion. All right, those state conventions, in order to move towards statehood, had to do 4 specific things. Number one, they had to invalidate all of the secession ordinances that had been ratified by state legislatures in 1861 as the Civil War began. He said, you must acknowledge that these things were wrong and that they could not be permitted the light of day. Number 2, all of these state conventions had to formally abolish slavery. Number 3, all the state conventions had to repudiate every cent of Confederate debt. They were not going to allow states to come back into the Union and have the debt from the Civil War be an issue that the federal government might have to deal with at some point or another. The 4th and final thing was that Johnson's state conventions required the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Well, several of the states took Johnson's plan and ran with it. But there were also southern states who said, no, we're going to go about this our own way. We're going to try to get back into the Union in the way we see fit. Congress met for the first time after the Civil War in December of 1865. So Lincoln's already dead and buried. John Wilkes Booth is dead. The conspirators who were involved in the assassination attempts against Johnson, Lincoln, Stanton, Seward, etc., had all been rounded up, had all been tried. Many of them had been hanged, and the nation was ready to move on. Well, at that December 1865 meeting of Congress, many of the southern states had sent ex-Confederate leaders, including Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens of Georgia, 4 generals, 6 colonels, and a number of other Confederate political officials with credentials to be seated in Congress. They said, okay, war's over, things should get back to normal, and normal for us means we pick our leaders. Well, the Republicans in Congress were aghast at this. They basically said, look, you are not going to seat these ex-Confederates as political officials in the United States. They refused to seat every single one of those leaders. At the same time, Southerners had done some other things to anger Congress, most particularly the passage of black codes, laws that were meant to restrict the freedoms of newly freed former slaves. Now, you have the South Carolina examples in the reading packet that I gave you before the snowstorm hit, to see some examples of what the black codes did. All right, now, to think about it, many of the states outlawed interracial marriage. Today, we wouldn't give that second thought. But in some states, that was actually considered a death penalty offense. Think about it. Death penalty for getting married to a person you love just because they're of a different color? Not good. In Mississippi, blacks were not allowed to own farmland. In South Carolina, blacks were not allowed to buy lots in South Carolina cities. In most of the Confederate states, blacks were not permitted to serve on juries. So you see an increasing gulf. Southerners on one hand want to dictate the terms of their re-entry. They want to have their cake and eat it too. On the other hand, the radicals in Congress are doing two things. One, they're clashing with the president because they don't like and they don't trust Andrew Johnson. On the other hand, they hate the Southerners even more. And now they're faced with this idea of, if we don't do something now, we're going to be faced with a bigger political problem. And so Congress takes additional steps in March of 1867, after warning them to slow down, after passing a Civil Rights Act in 1866, and seeing that basically ignored. Congress takes steps to create a different form of Reconstruction. Radicals passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship to all freed slaves. It says not only is slavery over, but all of these people have the same civil rights as anyone else in the country. If you look, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution mirrors the Civil Rights Act of 1866 in language and thought down to the letter. What Congress is saying is that we didn't trust the Confederacy, we didn't trust the Southern states to pass critical acts and legislation. Nor did we expect that they would enforce the things that we asked them to do. So, how do we handle it? Well, we handle it by putting it in the Constitution and saying, okay, we think enough about this to put it in the Constitution and say, okay, we're on record. It's out here for everyone to see and everyone to understand, and now it's up to you to enforce those ideas. Well, long story short, it didn't happen. So in March of 1867, Congress decides to take control of Reconstruction. They passed 3 acts that basically set up what we will come to know as Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. They passed the Military Reconstruction Act, which sets up military districts, 5 of them in the South. The only state that doesn't fall under that rule is Tennessee, because Tennessee had already ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Those 5 military districts would be run by a commanding officer and run under military or law of the militia. The Command of the Army Act basically set up the structure and expenditures of Reconstruction, and the Tenure of Office Act was passed to limit the power of the president. Tenure of Office Act is going to become the critical element in the first impeachment trial in United States presidential history. Andrew Johnson is going to have a huge problem, and that is going to lead to this first impeachment trial. Now, in the next piece, we're going to talk about the rest of military Reconstruction, and we're going to talk about the Senate trial of Andrew Johnson.